March of 1968, and you wrote afterwards, quote, "Chicago was seething with tension. What my wife and I had heard 14 stories high in our hotel was F. LBJ, F. Mayor Daley." Now, just 15 years before, the Korean War had taken place without protest. What had changed?
Well, they were to begin with a few tripwires: the assassination of Kennedy, then the assassination of Bobby Kennedy and of Martin Luther King, so that the atmosphere was simply getting very tense. That exploded in conjunction with heightened hostilities on the whole Vietnam issue.
I'd add that perhaps beginning with the Warren Commission, which I agree was one of the tripwires, there had arisen, I suppose it happens in every generation, but I think it was very salient in this one, a belief that the government was lying, or rather the recognition, the shock of recognition that that was true, that the government would lie to you openly and blatantly and on a major thing. I think that was the big discovery of that year.
In 1968, when Mr. Buckley was in a hotel room listening to Chance, you were in Cuba as an agricultural volunteer helping to plant coffee. Now, what I want to excavate here is, what on earth were you thinking? By the time one Englishman had arrived in Cuba, 1 million Cubans had fled. What were you thinking?
You were thinking to corner the coffee market.
Well, actually, it's true that...
were you a dedicated Marxist?
It's true they needed some coffee, and they still do, as a matter of fact. It's still rationed there, in spite of my best efforts. I was a dedicated Marxist. I was a member of an organization that was actually anti-Castroite organization. If you're really interested in my personal history, you have to get some sectarian minutiae in. It was a Luxembourgist Trotskyist organization, and we sent a delegation of people to see whether or not the Cuban Revolution was, as advertised, a break with the Soviet model, a new start and all of that. And this was remembered shortly after the death of the much controverted Ernesto Che Guevara. And it was a very interesting time to be there, because I was there during the invasion of Czechoslovakia, which was the point at which it became evident that Castroism was not going to live up to the advertised hopes. So it was a...
You were how old, Christopher?
I was then 19.
19, and you were in Oxford at that time?
I was at the end of my first year in Oxford, yes.
Right. Now, what I'm interested in is to the extent to which your thinking was in some way representative of the thinking of your generation. That is to say, those protesters in Chicago, those people planting beans in Cuba, were you an outlier? Were you especially ideological? Or was there a hard ideological core?
But we felt, in our little corner of the left, that the great thing about 1968 was exactly that. Both of the Cold War camps were undergoing a convulsion, and our great hope was, which was disappointed, was for a convergence between those two things.
Your great hope as a member of this small organization, the Trotskyite organization, or yes, your great hope, your generation's great hope? Well,
I think this was held in common by a lot of people who were completely new to politics and quite naive about it.
Right. Well, Bill, as you read the kids who were in the street protesting, how much of it was relatively sophisticated ideology? They weren't just rejecting the straight-laced lives of their parents, but the whole notion, the whole Cold War notion that communism was bad, we were good. And how much of it was just kind of naivete, romanticization of the commies, and so on?
Well, you've asked the hard questions. I mean, the fact is that there was a kind of a listlessness in the 60s, and that listlessness called for a kind of a masturbatory relief. People wanted to find if they could go ahead and get their kicks in some way that they hadn't been getting them, and the more so if they could wed them to some ideal. In fact, what it was primarily self-concern and an attempt to cast a noble perspective on what it is that you were up to.
You were engaged in narcissism,
I think
Christopher?
I'll have to quarrel literally as well as metaphorically with Mr. Buckley's characterization of it as masturbatory. Actually, it was quite celebrated for going the distance. Perhaps one of the great things about it was that it was the first generation, or perhaps one of the less great things about it, but at any rate one of the true things about it, one of the first generations to take the separation of sex and procreation for granted, which I think led to a great deal of jealousy, incidentally, not to say envy. among preceding generations.
The pill came into wide use just about then.
I think it might be worth making a distinction between being, as it were, a 68er or soixante huitard, as the more pretentious of us call ourselves, and a 60s person, because anyone born in the right boom bracket can claim to have been a 60s person. And the way it's all represented now retrospectively, airbrushed and rewritten, is beads, caftans, exactly as Mr. Buckley says, make love, not war, Woodstock Nation, all that. Now that was sort of common generationally, as common as, say, James Dean had been a bit earlier. But what we're talking about, I believe, is the 60s left. In other words, the attempt to block what we thought of, correctly in my view still, as an imperialist and aggressive and unjust war.
The war in Vietnam. You oppose it on moral and ideological grounds as aggressive and imperialist.
Yes.
Now, so my question is, you really believed that? You thought that the United States was the United States was the offending party?
I would affirm it now. In fact, with greater knowledge and infinitely larger depth of evidence to draw upon, yes.
That the Chinese, the Soviets supplying the North Vietnamese were the good guys in this one?
I think the hardest thing probably to get people to remember now, even though they must remember it at the time, or should, is that the official reason given for intervention in Vietnam, well, there were several, and they kept changing, but one of them was that it was to stop Chinese expansionism into the Indo-Chinese peninsula. That's now considered so ridiculous, and it's so self-evidently untrue, that it's hard to remember that that was one of the official alibis.
Are you saying that it was untrue and known to be untrue at the time?
Well, whether or not Mr. Rusk, say, believed that a South Vietnamese post-French colonial buffer state, guaranteed and underwritten by the US, was an insurance against Chinese expansionism or not, I don't know. But I do know that that's what he maintained. It seems fantastic, doesn't it?
But the godfather of that impulse was containment. The doctrine of containment had been around since 1945, 46. Czechoslovakia had provoked a reinvigoration of it, i.e., they must go no further. And behind that impulse is, to be sure, a perfectly raw colonialism, which is everywhere displayed, but also the threat of China doing what they did in Korea 10 years earlier.
On this containment question,
yes,
as well as containment, in other words, the reaction to the Stalinization of Eastern Europe, there was also something that had been going on during and after the Second World War, namely and unnoticed because it could be assimilated under the rubric of containment or anti-communism, which was the United States becoming, without a vote or really much of a debate on the subject, the successor state to the former European empires. Okay, to the British in part of the Mediterranean and the Middle East, especially after Suez in '56, to the French in Indochina, which is my main point.
You're not going to let him get away with calling us an empire,
but also to the Portuguese.
I'll flip this one to you in a moment. Go ahead.
The French in and the Belgians in the Congo, to the French and Portuguese, and even in the Dutch in Indonesia. Remember the coup in Indonesia in '65. Now, the origin of what some has called the morass or quagmire in Vietnam is the decision by Eisenhower and Dulles to inherit French colonial rule in Vietnam. That's really the situation. The United States put itself in the position of being a classical colonial imperial power. I don't myself believe that they had a prayer of reversing that verdict by continuing to bomb and destroy more of Vietnam than they actually did. And remember, they covered it pretty much from end to end. I don't think we really say there wasn't enough violence used on the Vietnamese, can you?
Well,
it was suggested to President Eisenhower that we intervene to prevent Dien Bien Phu, and he resisted. He said no. So in that sense, he said French colonialism has to look after itself. But looking after itself is different from being colonized by another entity, to wit, a Soviet entity, against which we were globally engaged. And it mattered enormously when looking down on the old Vietnam, it appeared that Vietnam, the North, was to be the aggressor to the South, threatening all that lay in the West.
Closing questions on Vietnam. Do you wish, from this vantage point, that we had simply never gone in?
Yes.
You do. Christopher, let me ask you what you wish. Between the fall of Vietnam and the fall of the Berlin Wall, I counted them up, and there are at least 9 countries, at least 9, that fell under Soviet domination. Do you feel, as a coffee planter in Cuba and a Trotskyite, any responsibility for the period of misery the people of those countries endured?
Any personal responsibility?
Yes, actually, any personal responsibility. You and the generation of '68, the protesters.
I really think it would be grandiose of me to accept any,
symbolic.
but I also
Symbolic.
think...
All right, symbolic,
no,
symbolic.
Morally, no, of course I don't, because I was and
You were right then.
I always was a vocal opponent of that, and I consider the revolution of 1989...
Vocal opponent of what? Of the Soviet Union?
Yes.
What do you regret that you did? Let me ask that. What do you regret that you did in the '60s?
I think that I regret there was a slogan that was painted on the walls of Paris at one point in the great upheaval of May '68, which said, "Take your desires for reality." I think there was a certain hedonistic utopianism around, which, though I tried to...
You grant Bill's point about the self-indulgence.
Oh, I thought I did so except by substituting fornication for masturbation. Thought I'd already clarified that.
All right, fine.
Saying, no, it was going all the way. It wasn't onanism.
And what do you regret that you did?
Well, I regret that I didn't, sooner than we did, come forward with a countdown on the Vietnam War. We were always being told in 68, 69, 70, victory's around the corner. And they tend to say that persuasively. A lot of people were persuaded. I went to Vietnam 3 times and wrote back that it looked good. I was told it looked good.
You regret trusting the government of the United States?
Well, it's not so much the government I trust. It is individual people working their own perspectives. Now, you can call that government if indeed you say, well, he works for the government. But I saw them, and I thought I saw them making individual... I spent a night in a bunker with General Abrams, and he wasn't giving